And Gary, you should have the floor now. If you could share your desktop with your slides, we can get underway.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a delight for me to be with you this afternoon or whatever time of day it is where you find yourself. And I want to very much thank Ira for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I hope some of which, what I have to say, might add some value. As you could have seen from my photograph, I am a boomer. And as a boomer in many instances these days, I am disqualified to talk about the subject because it's my fault and the fault of my peer group. However, with age comes a little bit of wisdom, and I want to share some of that if it's helpful to you. First of all, before I get into the slides, one of the things that I tell all the people with whom I work is that context is everything. So what is my context? Ira laid out some of the things I've done, some of which succeeded beyond my wildest dreams and some of which failed miserably. But I did learn a lot. I have never been a professor, don't have a PhD. I did start the Center for Sustainable Communities at the University of Washington, and I've lectured in architecture, in planning, in engineering,
Hi.
Hello.
It's not terrible. Great.
I'm sorry, we're on a web call here. Are you part of it?
Mm-hmm.
Don't know what's going on, which is par for the course.
Can
Anyway,
everyone please mute themselves other than the speaker?
Yeah, go ahead, Gary. I will find the violator on my control panel and exclude them.
well, don't be too harsh. That said, while I've not been responsible for curriculum and education, I have been responsible for hiring and leading your students, the students you produce in the professional classes.
The idea would be representing sustainability and design at the Green Living Fair. Mm-hmm.
I am now unmuted. Somebody muted me, which is probably the best thing for all of us. But
that was me. Go ahead.
So let me talk about a few things that I think matter. So here's a thought problem. How would you answer your constituency's question? In what ways are the successes of your students material to the success of society and themselves? One of the big challenges we all face is the translation of knowledge into action that actually results in change. And what I've seen, particularly in the private sector, working with engineers and planners and architects and others, is that the belief system that the right answer is knowable, therefore learning is not necessary, ends up being a huge barrier to progress. So some points upon which I'd like to touch. Can we get there from here if it's considered a green agenda? when instead it requires concurrent technical feasibility, economic viability, and political acceptance. So, a story about the Green New Deal. One of the things that should have been known, was known by many, was taking this political agenda, which made a lot of sense with regard to reducing the cost of a variety of change for communities, is that by labeling it green as though sustainability is only a green idea, an environmental idea, works against the acceptance by a number of important travelers who need to be part of the solution. I was a negotiator for the US at the first Earth Summit. And at that Earth Summit, we almost had a deal between the environmental community and the business community on how to define sustainability as a robust business case instead of an environmental case. That ended up being torn up at the last minute because of a number of NGOs from Europe decided that they would take the position that if you didn't know the outcome, you shouldn't act, as though the unknowable was a barrier to progress. We need to find ways in all of these works to actually marry the notion of technical feasibility, economic viability, and political acceptance. And if that balance can't be struck, then it's unlikely that there's going to be very much action that takes place. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about all of these things, so I'm just going to go ahead a little bit. For the academy, whether it's being for particular departments or for individual faculty or subparts of faculties, the specializations necessary for academic promotion can be, and I would suggest are, a significant barrier to mastering interdisciplinary complexity. And interdisciplinary complexity is necessary if you're going to meet those three tests I talked about earlier, the technical, the economic, and the political. I've seen too many times where struggles over winning, particularly struggles between university departments over share, is a barrier. And a couple things apply to this. One is Merton's law. Merton's law, a fellow named Merton, who Ira and I both have high regard for, talked about the inevitability that for every intended consequence, there are multiple unintended consequences. Some of those unintended consequences will be neutral, some of them will be bad, some of them will be good. The ability to actually not just act, but follow the consequence of the action so you can remedy those things that are not working in your favor is an important thing and requires multidisciplinary thinking. Requires that you be able to go outside your department or you're outside your particular curriculum and talk to other departments. When I was at the University of Washington, I got in serious trouble with my dean by requiring that every one of my classes had people in them from multiple different disciplines, because it worked against the measurement of the provost, which transferred money to departments based upon the notion of student hour contacts. If we weren't contacting our own students, but instead contacting other students, we didn't get credit for it. Well, that may make sense within the context of a university system. It doesn't make any sense with regard to actually learning how to work across systems in order to solve complex problems. When I was planning director in Seattle, the chairman of my planning commission was also the chairman of the Department of Urban Planning at the University of Washington. And he decided it would be good for me to 1 year accompany him to the American Society for Collegiate Schools of Planning annual meeting. And so it was worked out that my job there was to attend as many sessions as possible and then give a summary speech on what I'd learned as someone who wasn't part of the academy. And like in many instances, I didn't turn out to be popular, but I posed the initial question: as the planning director of the 20th largest city in America, what should I learn from the fact that I have not understood almost anything that's been said in any of the seminars? Because they were largely driven by people who were going into academia rather than people who were going into practice. The opportunity of people in practice to actually convey practice learning to the broader establishment of planning seemed to be difficult. Also, departmental accreditation peer review can be a significant barrier to mastering complexity. The essence of sustainability, resilience, adaptation, and retrenchment and retrenchment is where the conversations seem to be going, that in many places they're saying resilience is essentially giving up, that they actually need to move communities out of the way of events that might damage people, and harm property. The peer review accreditation is all driven about the past primarily. At least that was my experience in going through 4 accreditations in my life, where people from competing universities would come in based upon their understanding of what mattered with regard to education and test the prevailing theories within the institutions being reviewed about how they met that consideration. The opportunities to actually grow curriculum in the midst of that dialogue, as opposed to reflect back to the accreditors what they thought ought to happen, was very difficult, and actually terrified many of the younger faculty who felt like they had something new to contribute, but didn't really see that there was an opportunity for them to do that. In the private sector, this is also the case, in many government organizations as well, but it comes under a different framework. I once talked about with regard to AECOM, the company for which I was a chief sustainability officer, and my job was to try to change our brand so we authentically were offering our clients a more sustainable set of deliverables to help our clients be more successful and help their clients be more successful. The barrier I discussed was, I referred to without much respect, was the great constipated middle. The young students coming in, the young employees coming in, those people who really wanted to make a difference were repressed by the people in the middle of the organization who didn't get to where they were by taking risks. They got to where they were by practicing the practices that they've always done. So not only were we unable to deliver good work, we also face the problem that the biggest cost for any private sector company is training and the loss of a workforce that then had to be recruited and retrained again. So the constipated middle was pushing people out into other organizations and creating a whole new set of competitors that AECOM had prepared. It seems that a similar sort of thing has set itself up within the university systems, not only in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere, where the desire to be competitive in one narrow band works against this notion that complexity is the most important thing to teach. There is a necessary role for managing fear and doubt, even though people want certainty. Again, back in my planning director days and subsequent to that as a city manager and elsewhere, I occasionally saw a psychologist or a psychiatrist help me with my own needs. And in one of those sessions, this delightful woman who was tough as nails said, you know, you need my help, but not interpersonally. You need my help because I've been reading the papers and you don't have a clue why people are reacting to your recommendations the way they are reacting. And so we ended up once a quarter getting 15 to 20 psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists to come in and meet with my staff to discuss the question, when we say this, why do people act this way? And it had nothing to do with facts, it had to do with fear. How do you actually take hard questions like sustainability, hard questions like resilience, and incorporate them into conversations that actually increase the likelihood that people will want you to be successful rather than increase people's fear? The need for humanities and the technical specialties to find merger points to deal with these fear questions, I think, is ever more evident in these days and has been evident for a long time. And hopefully when we have a chance to converse, we can talk about this more. The flip side of this question is how did it end up that sustainability and environmental justice are treated as separate ideas? At the first Earth Summit and at Habitat 2 as well as Habitat 1, the notion of justice was a key part of the discussion of sustainability. And for many people, it's no longer a key part. We keep focusing on the environmental aspects of sustainability, and we get very good at material sciences and we get very good at discussions of energy. We don't get very good at discussing how those things relate to whether people's lives are safer and whether there are greater opportunities for them to be more successful and their children more successful as they move forward. In New York, the Department of Energy for the city has done a lot of work to try to increase the capacity of their energy systems, but they haven't actually incorporated the increased cost of energy to poor households as part of their considerations. So as they're looking at their rate bases, the justice orientation of rate increases is not part of their considerations and typically is not part of rate in discussions for any public infrastructure. Leaving the sociology and leaving some sort of economics that relate to justice out of those conversations, I think, is going to be a barrier to getting the constituencies necessary for sustainability to be more progressive idea. My PhD work, which I never completed, was in political philosophy. And I studied logic and I studied dialectic analysis as part of that. When I was at the University of Washington, I was hired by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to answer the question, why should the OECD care about Habitat 2? For those of you who aren't familiar, the OECD is made up now of the 30 largest economies of the world, and the OECD board is the Treasury official chief financial officer for each of those countries. And they were interested in Habitat 2 because it had to do with the future of cities, and cities were major sources of revenue for national treasuries around the world. So they asked me to take a look at whether they should care or not. So I attended all of the pre-conferences for the Habitat meetings and wrote a paper, set up a series of 7 dialectics on the extremes around the major arguments that were going on between the developed world and the developing world about the future of urbanism. And it ended up being something that the OECD didn't care about at all. And that disappointed. But it turned out that the G77 plus China, which is the 144 non-aligned nations plus China, were in the audience when I made my presentation, and it mattered to them a lot. So that paper ended up being the framework for which all negotiations at Habitat 2 took place. Philosophy and dialectic were not part of the considerations of sustainability at the time, but the tools ended up being extraordinarily useful at dissecting the attributes that needed to be resolved between these various countries and their ministers. Another issue is the problem of privilege. A guy named Richard Barnard discusses this in much better terms than I will. Privilege in agenda setting is one of the things that we're seeing now more and more. My wife is an academic, and she tells me that these days there are many, many more things that cannot be spoken about within a university setting because the notion that only certain people have the moral authority to raise the question is getting key. In sustainability, in resilience and adaptation, the question of who gets to decide what's appropriate to talk about is something that used to be decided almost solely in university settings. Now it's being decided in the high-tech companies. It's being decided by people who are talking about smart tech. It's decided by people who are in banks. It's not decided by people in the academy, where there used to be opportunities to actually have full and robust discussions as opposed to narrow discussions. So, and a couple of things that we can't talk about very much anymore. We can't talk about how population growth is the biggest barrier to sustainability in the world. The Sustainable Development Goals are all about removing barriers to population growth, when it is the growth itself and resource consumption associated with that growth that constitutes one of the biggest problems we need to overcome. We also can't talk about various energy sources. We really like talking about green energy, which is primarily wind and solar, in some cases hydroelectric. We can't talk about nuclear. There are almost no schools that teach nuclear engineering anymore outside of the Naval Academy and at Purdue. So why is that? Well, if you break it down, nuclear energy, the loss of life associated with nuclear energy as opposed to nuclear war, nuclear energy has been relatively small in comparison to the loss of life associated with greenhouse gases and pollution from coal and fossil fuels. But because the the problems associated with coal and fossil fuels are slow disasters, and nuclear energy disasters are fast. They're more terrifying. We also aren't talking about the reality that while electrical energy, battery-powered vehicles are a good thing, we have no way to actually dispose of the battery or the chemicals or the materials in the batteries that are highly pollutant and have a half-life almost as long as nuclear energy. So getting in sustainability so we don't have to fear actual conversations about the relative balance of risk as opposed to abrupt versus slow risk is something else I think we could have a long conversation about. This is I've touched on a little bit already, sustainability, curricula, and identity politics. I used to, and still do when I'm talking with community organizations, talk about the battle over pronouns. The pronouns I, we, and they. Almost every problem is set up as an I, they problem. I am harmed, they are the cause, they should quit doing what they're doing. And the notion of we is not part of the dynamic. If sustainability is actually about mastering complexity, then we ends up being the most important part of it. I used to, working with community groups and with private sector organizations, lay out what I would refer to as constituency maps. On one side would be those people who are going to agree with us no matter what. On the other side were those people who were never going to agree with us. In the middle were those people who are watching the exchange, trying to decide who actually seemed more trustworthy and who made the more sense. In politics, almost all of the money is spent on trying to win hearts of I and nudging we in their direction and trying to defeat the they, when the they will never change. So there are all sorts of theys out there who will never accept the notion that the future is constituent of every present decision, that those people in the future matter. Those theys are critical attributes of every problem we're trying to solve today, because they aren't us. They aren't part of our considerations today. Which takes me to this notion that we need to increase the amount of good political science in sustainability. Because unless we can find ways to actually help political leadership feel less at risk in supporting the notion that things have to be different for their constituents, we're not going to make very much progress. I'm close to the end here. I have, as I said early on, been part of the academy, but mostly I've been part of the market that's been hiring students and the minds and skills of those people you've been teaching. And here's a research example of why I wasn't popular with my peers when I was in academia. The research courses were all about helping students prepare to do their research to go on and get their PhDs. The research courses that I needed taught when I was hiring professionals were much more abbreviated, and they would take this form. I would get a call from the mayor or a member of the city council who would say, in an hour, I have person X coming into my office and they're going to try to convince me of why. I need to know whether to listen or not, or how to respond. I need you in my office in 45 minutes with an answer. Now, this was pre-internet, so it required a little more being fast on your feet. But that kind of research, the research that's directed toward answering a political question to reduce the risk for the leader who has to make the choice, is as valuable to the people coming through your curricula as that research experience having to do with how to do your PhD work. And there'll probably be lots of questions about that as well. So my last slide has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. I shared with Ira a paper I wrote for the UN, and they were interested in the question, what might change in the future that would change the meaning of each of the Sustainable Development Goals? So I took a look at that and at the 17 goals and how we got from the 5 original goals at the first Earth Summit, or the second Earth Summit, to the 17 goals at the third Earth Summit. And it had to do with a whole bunch of constituencies who felt like they were being left out of the goals when there were only 5. And that was probably true. The difficulty is that, as they say in many MBA courses, if you have more than 3 priorities, you don't have any at all. So how are you going to take these 17 priorities and actually blend them so that you have an actionable set of 3 that can reinforce one another? You can make deductions and inductions from the answers you're getting from each, so that the researchers who are working on individual questions know that they need to touch on research being done by their peers in other goal areas. I think that that's one of the key questions for the academy these days. The Sustainable Development Goals are getting much more traction among local governments in the US and in many Fortune 500 companies. They have a tremendous amount of traction in Europe and in Australia, some in the Middle East, and some in the Far East, or in East Asia. Many of your students will need to know how to take these goal areas and not focus on them in particular, but as a set of interrelated parts. I want to thank you. I hope this was useful to at least some of you. There's my contact information. I actually do believe the academy is the way we're going to get out of this mess. I think that students really need to understand better how to take what they've learned and apply it within their professional contexts, not only in if they go on to teach, but also as they go on to help their communities be successful. And as I tell every group I work with, the end goal for all of this is no matter who's doing the work, to be able to go home and sit with their friends and families and loved ones and say, what I learned today and what I put in practice actually made things better for more people than I ever would have imagined. And that's your job. I'm glad you have it. And I'll leave it now to Ira to move us ahead.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm sure we all appreciated your insights gained through the vast experience that you've had over the years in a range of different contexts. And I do have some questions here for you, and others are coming in. And there are a couple, including one from Joel Harmon, which is, I'll just combine a few SDG related questions into one. If you could, Gary, and elaborating on the SDGs and its significance in a curricular context, how would you translate your observations that you just offered at the end there about the SDGs into structuring a course or a program?
Well, I think that's it's a very hard question, an excellent question, and I want to do it justice. So one of the things that's true about the SDG set is that in order to satisfy each constituency that their key issues are being dealt with seriously, they have separated constituencies one from another. And they're investing a huge amount of money in research, drilling deep on attributes of each of the 17 goal areas without actually investing any money at all on the relationships that run across them. So if I were to suggest, and this again simple to say, if I was to suggest structuring a course, I would try to find somebody to represent each of those 17 goal areas and set up a series of initial seminars focused on the question, how does this relate to that? What would I do in this goal area if I were trying to nudge progress in 3 other goal areas? And you can pick and choose which they would be. But training in this cross-disciplinary thinking in terms of nudging, that you're not going to solve every goal collectively, but you can nudge improvements in one by making the right kind of investments in the other. Figure out how you can do a set of 4 as opposed to a individual aggregate of 17. I think that would be big progress. And once you started down that path, you can then say, okay, we did this set, what other set? And then as you start to develop your aggregations, you can think about, okay, if I actually wanted to advise the UN by applying foresight to what's going on in the world across these systems, here's ways in which you might approach it.
To continue, Gary, on the SDG topic, which seems to have struck a chord here with the audience, I'll just ask you, are you suggesting this aggregation or clustering of selected goals because it's your observation that in the real world, and we're talking about the theme of this webinar being the reality check for those teaching in higher education, is your observation that that's actually what the emerging practice or best practice is, both with governments and the private sector?
Well, for me, the core issue is there's not enough money or time in the world to go deep on every one of these issues all at once. And so you have to figure out some way to leverage improvements across systems as opposed to solving individual goals. So it's a resource question. In some cases, it's an intelligence question, but more it's a resource question. Everybody wants their research grants to focus on their individual needs. Everybody's graduate students want to publish in ways that can get them their initial jobs in great universities like the ones represented on this call. But that's just not possible. my view. People may have other views, but it's not possible in my view. So
Well,
I'm just trying to be pragmatic.
yeah. Well, let's keep talking about the SDGs a bit, because there are quite a few questions that have come in. Some of them are visible in the chat box. Others were posted privately. So, for example, Matt Polsky is pushing back on you by saying that, well, isn't it inconsistent with complexity to reduce the 17 goals to 3 priorities?
And I'm not suggesting it be reduced to 3. I'm just suggesting that if you're going to get action, you have to narrow it down so that people can actually see how their investments in change are bearing fruit. The private sector is pretty clear about this. I mean, that whether they're right or not, I'll leave that to others to decide. But when Royal Dutch Shell, for instance, did their foresight work, their notion was, okay, we don't know what's going to happen in the petroleum industry. So we can't actually cover the entire universe of possibilities. We can pick 3 things that are more likely to happen than not, and plan strategies on how we would address those, and as things unfold, tailor them to some other needs. So I fully agree that each of the 17 goal areas has extraordinarily high utility. I'm just suggesting that if anybody knows of resources or political will necessary to deal with all of them all at once, I haven't seen it.
So just to take this a step further on the SDGs, and I think that was a useful clarification, Gary. This is another point that I think deserves clarification. Are you accepting the SDGs as the consensus roadmap for the next for when they, as of 2015, the consensus roadmap for the next 15 years through 2030 for sustainability, or are you suggesting that it was the wrong path to follow?
No, I'm, as though this might matter, I'm fine with the SDGs. I was fine with the initial set of 5 because I think you could have gotten to the same place, but again, you were leaving all sorts of constituencies unrepresented at the set of 5 that needed, in a membership organization like the UN, needed to see their issues on the chart. So 17 is better, and you can drill down your research down in much finer detail in each of the 17 areas, which of course will be subdivided yet again as you go into the core. The question for me is always, okay, let's divide these up, let's get as detailed as we can. Then how are we actually going to bring these back together in a way that are actionable given the resources we have available?
So we do have some questions that are not necessarily SDG specific. And so, for example, I don't believe in your presentation, although I might have missed it, that you alluded to the increasingly popular buzz phrase, circular economy. Do you think that circular economy is a useful construct? Do you think it's a useful proxy for sustainability or sustainable development, for use particularly in those circles that don't particularly care for green or sustainability lexicon?
Yeah, I like the concept. It's not new. It's been around since the 40s. It just gets renamed now and then, but the notion that every investment has to reinforce the next set of investments and reduce the consequences of that investment as it's going forward makes perfect sense. There were, I can't remember his name anymore, Dr. Robert from Sweden or Norway, I can't remember. They did a lot of work on this notion of circular economy having to do with base resources. The current conversations have to do not only with basic resources, but also with labor markets, with thoughts, information technology, all sorts of things. So yeah, it works for me.
Well, moving on to another question and comment, and I would observe that I thought you made a number of not only insightful comments in your presentation, but also some that were quite provocative. And one comment that was posted privately, I'll read to you, Gary, and see if you have a response. I agree that population is a major factor that can't be ignored in sustainability discussions in context, of course, of consumption levels of places where growth or decline occurs. However, more and more raising this topic, it is often labeled as racist or as part of an anti-human ideology. How should this response be countered?
It's absolutely right. That's how it's dealt with. And I met with some folks from London who were talking about the extinction revolution, whatever it is, and that they're very much worried about the practices of the business community and government increasing the likelihood that our species will go extinct. And hold on, because I'm going to say something provocative after I say this. The issue is that if it's left unsaid, then it suggests that no matter how big our population gets, we can figure out how to have the resources necessary for people to have a quality of life that we as a species would like one another to have. And so it ends up being a qualities of lives question as opposed to a total population question. And yeah, I haven't been accused of being a racist, but I have been accused of being thoughtless with regard to the notion that if we suggest that there are limits to growth with regard to population that need to be accounted for as we think about how we are going to create cities and create infrastructure and a variety of other things, then we're not having a complete thought. I don't know what to do about it, but it is something that's on my mind. I was meeting with UNDP and UNEP in Nairobi, their notion being that you can't mention the word population without making it a racist idea. Well, perhaps if that's what you want to do with the notion, it has to do with the number of people on the planet. And this is what I'm going to say that will likely provoke. I've said in maybe too many audiences that I thought we got started in the wrong place with the discussions about sustainability. We have treated it as though it's our job to sustain the earth. And the earth will continue no matter what we do. We are irrelevant to the future of the planet. What we're trying to sustain is our species within the context of the other species, flora and fauna necessary for us to have successful lives. And the focus on the environment rather than us, I think, has worked against us as we've tried to figure out how to increase the constituency for sustainability.
Well, as we start to wind down, Gary, I have, I think, two more questions for you. So again, back to the theme of reality check. The reality is that we're in the run-up to the presidential election this fall. We just lived through Super Tuesday. Everything is shaking out as a result of that. And so, given the Trump administration policies and coming from the other direction, given the Green New Deal resolution, what, from the practitioner side of things, what are the observations that you can convey to teaching faculty about the current reality?
Well, the Green New Deal, as it was constructed, made a huge amount of sense, except for how it was labeled. And labeling it green gave opponents the opportunity to start taking shots immediately before anybody was able to have a good conversation about what was intended by this idea. If you were to talk about a better New Deal or a more constructive New Deal or something like that as opposed to green, there was a fighting chance that the discussion could have been more positive. Now, more positive within the White House, I have given up on the notion that anything positive can come out of this White House. But there are a number of other institutions, like the 230 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who have come out and declared that they believe sustainability matters, they believe that climate matters, and they want to do something about it, and then getting lambasted by the Department of the Treasury for using the word climate. That's the sort of odds we're up against. And by the way, I advise all of my clients to never use the term climate, to only talk about weather, because weather, people want to talk about the weather. They still find the notion of climate as being a little obscure. But there are chances. But since I've been involved in this business, sustainability business, in 1992, it's always been the case that local and state government, rather than federal and national, international governments, are where the change has to take place. Because the changes can be seen, can be reacted to, and as the changes don't work, they can be responded to. So I get indigestion every day thinking about what's going on in this country in terms of national politics. And same as I'm now have indigestion about what's going on in the UK. But I then think back to, well, think about all of the local governments who are doing this huge amount of good around the world and working very hard on behalf of their governments and their constituencies to make things better in spite of the fact that the resistance would put up, and that's what keeps me going.
Well, to avoid further indigestion, let me move to a different type of reality check, and that is you came close to addressing this in part of your presentation when you alluded to faculty and the students who will be leaving their programs and looking for jobs. And that brings us to a very popular topic at the present time in sustainability in higher education, the question of competencies. And so I would ask you in closing what your thoughts are. What should faculty keep front of mind as they think about constructing their courses and their programs in light of the competencies that are needed on the practitioner and policymaking side, which I know that you can articulate?
I'll do my best. So on the tech side of things, we need competencies in both understanding what is or is not smart. We have this revolution started in Silicon Valley that in terms of, particularly on the planning side of things, smartness is nirvana. If you talk to the engineering firms around the world, they'll say, well, we can actually do smart tech in new development, but it's impossible in the retrofit of existing cities because the cost associated with digging up all those streets and applying the sensors and applying all that other stuff makes it infeasible with regard to the politically acceptable rate bases. So being able to distinguish what's smart versus what's wise, given the kind of planning and sustainability you're trying to do, I think is really important. I think it's also really important that theater arts are really important. One of the things I did as a planning director and as a city manager was require anybody who had to face the public to take a course that we paid for in terms of presentations, theater. And I also did things like required everybody in my department, particularly in Seattle planning, from the clerical staff up to me, everybody had to make a presentation to the mayor at least once a year. Because it wasn't enough for us to think we were smarter than him. We needed to understand how he thought, how he received information, how to tell whether it was the right time to bring an issue up with him versus not the right time. Because with these complex organizations in which we're placing students have their own character, and we need to understand that character. And I'll give you two examples. Mayor Norm Rice, fantastic human being, was up to be the Secretary of HUD under Clinton, taught at Harvard on a variety of things related to sustainable communities. He's the one who allowed us to do this comprehensive plan as a sustainability strategy. He called me up one day and said, you have 3 minutes to be in my office. And I was on the first floor, he was on the 12th floor, and the elevators weren't working. So I showed up in kind of a sweaty mess, and his assistant said, get in there and shut the door. And so I figured that was my last day. And so I did that. He had his back to me. I stood there sweating. He turned around and looked at me. He said, if you ever let an Ivy League trained policy analyst in my office again, you're fired. And I said, well, about a third of my staff were from the Ivy League. I said, I hear that, sir. Can you take it a little farther? Why? He said, because there's a fundamental difference between knowing who's smarter and knowing who's in charge. So I would say that practical training and the differences between knowing more and helping somebody who has to deliver be more successful with what you know is something that I would and have always stressed. And finally, as part of the curriculum, I would think that knowing how to talk to other professions is of fundamental importance. The way that an engineer views the world and the way that a landscape architect views the world and a planner views the world and right, you can go on and on forever. They all have similar traits, but they can have fundamental differences as well. And it will be everybody's job to make everyone around them more successful than they might otherwise be if the idea you're promoting actually matters. Winning and succeeding are different ideas. And too much competition takes place between the professions that get trained to think that what they know matters more rather than what they know is an asset to what everyone else knows in a way that you can help communities be more successful. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I think that was a very apt way of wrapping up for today. Again, Gary, really appreciate you sharing your insights and your provocations. I also want to thank you for your support of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium, as evidenced by your recent joining of the SEC Advisory Council. Much appreciated. And we look forward to continue to draw upon your vast and deep experience. So with that, I'll say farewell till our next webinar and urge those listening still to this webinar to take a look at the call for proposals for the curriculum colloquium that will take place in conjunction with the AASHE conference in early October. Thank you very much.
Great.